While the world largely believed our longest reigning monarch slipped away peacefully in the tranquil isolation of the Scottish Highlands, a source within the inner circle has finally revealed the devastating series of Sussex-induced stresses, cruel ultimatums, and one ultimately unforgivable snub that truly broke Queen Elizabeth's heart in her final days. To fully grasp the gravity of this profound betrayal, one must first look at the stark, tragic contrast between the Queen's twilight years and the relentless melodrama emanating from Montecito during that same period. For over 7 decades, Her Majesty was the very embodiment of stoic duty, a woman who meticulously placed the crown and the stability of the nation far above any personal grievance or physical discomfort. Yet, as she entered her mid-90s and her health inevitably began to wane, she was denied the one thing she most richly deserved: a quiet, dignified, and peaceful final chapter surrounded by a unified family. Instead, the twilight of her extraordinary reign was repeatedly hijacked by the loud, self-serving, and fiercely entitled narrative spun by Prince Harry and Meghan, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that permeated the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle. The sheer exhaustion of having to continuously navigate this transatlantic public relations war took an undeniable and heavy toll on a monarch who simply wished to spend her remaining days in the comforting embrace of her lifelong sanctuary. The atmosphere within the royal household during those final years was, by all accounts, thick with an unprecedented and deeply stifling sense of dread. A well-placed source recently detailed how the mood among the Queen's most loyal courtiers would instantly sour the moment a new headline or broadcast alert originated from California, knowing all too well the distress it would subsequently cause their beloved sovereign. It was a time when the famous red boxes containing sensitive state secrets and vital government business were abruptly forced to share the Queen's desk with briefed summaries of the latest petty demands, perceived slights, or public attacks launched by her own grandson and his wife. The pressure on the staff was immense as they valiantly attempted to shield Her Majesty from the most vitriolic elements of the Sussexes media campaign, whilst simultaneously understanding that she needed to be kept fully apprised of matters that actively threatened the institution she had sworn to protect. This constant, simmering tension meant that courtiers were perpetually walking on eggshells, forced to manage a barrage of highly emotional, completely unpredictable crises that were fundamentally alien to the measured, tradition-bound operation of the British monarchy. It is entirely tragic to consider that the very people tasked with ensuring the Queen's comfort were instead preoccupied with mitigating the relentless fallout of a spectacularly bitter and entirely unnecessary family feud. Beneath the polished veneer of royal protocol and the stiff upper lip she had perfected over a lifetime, the physical and emotional toll of this relentless barrage on Queen Elizabeth was becoming distressingly apparent to those closest to her. A long-time family acquaintance has whispered of the deep private sorrow the monarch carried, an internal monologue surely filled with profound bewilderment as to how a grandson she had loved so dearly could so callously weaponize his royal status against the very family that had nurtured him. One can only imagine the sheer, isolating agony of watching her legacy be dragged through the mud of American talk shows and tell-all memoirs, knowing that her physical fragility left her entirely unable to publicly defend the institution she had sacrificed her entire life to build. The stress was not merely an abstract concept. It was a tangible, heavy burden that noticeably drained her precious reserves of energy, forcing her to confront a deeply personal betrayal at a time when she should have been reflecting with pride on a lifetime of unblemished service. Ultimately, the long-term consequences of this exhausting saga were not just measured in damaged public relations or fractured family ties, but in the theft of an elderly woman's final moments of peace, leaving a permanent bitter stain on the history of the House of Windsor that no amount of Californian rebranding can ever truly wash away. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the timing regarding the Oprah Winfrey interview is something that those within the inner circle still struggle to discuss without a visible tremor of indignation. At the very moment this televised broadside was being prepared for global consumption, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's strength and stay for over 70 years, lay gravely ill, his legendary vitality finally flickering out in the sterile quiet of a hospital ward and then the hushed rooms of Windsor. A well-placed source has described the atmosphere within the castle during those weeks as one of profound leaden anxiety, where the staff moved in near silence, and the Queen herself seemed to shrink into the vastness of her private apartments. It was a period of anticipatory grief for a husband she was clearly losing, yet she was forced to endure the knowledge that her grandson and his wife were, at that very moment, providing the ammunition for a public execution of the family's reputation. One can only imagine the Queen's inner monologue during those long, lonely evenings, the staggering bewilderment of a woman who had spent a lifetime practicing the art of the unsaid, now watching as her own flesh and blood bartered private family dynamics for the fleeting approval of an American television audience. The isolation she must have felt was not merely physical. It was the isolation of a sovereign realized that the sacred code of silence, which had protected the monarchy for centuries, had been shattered by the very people she had tried so desperately to accommodate. When the interview finally aired, the impact was less like a news event and more like a targeted demolition, timed with a precision that many close to the palace found nothing short of sadistic. While Prince Philip's life was receding, the airwaves were filled with accusations of racism and neglect, effectively painting the Queen's life's work as a cold, oppressive cage rather than a service to the nation. A source within the inner circle recalls how the senior courtiers huddled in small groups, their faces etched with a mixture of fury and disbelief, as they realized the sheer scale of the character assassination being leveled against the institution. The pressure on the Queen to respond was immense, yet she remained anchored in her dignity, even as the narrative shifted from her husband's impending passing to the supposed victimhood of a couple living in a multi-million-dollar mansion. This was not just a family quarrel, it was a psychological assault on an elderly woman at her most vulnerable, a moment where the private sanctity of a dying marriage was sacrificed on the altar of celebrity truth. The surrounding pressure from the global media was suffocating, turning the final weeks of a historic partnership into a sordid backdrop for a California soap opera, a reality that the Queen absorbed with a quiet, devastating grace that her detractors will never truly understand. The long-term consequences of this particular betrayal cannot be overstated, for it signaled the definitive end of the Queen's hope for a private reconciliation. The Oprah interview didn't just hurt the monarchy's standing, it wounded the Queen's spirit in a way that those who saw her daily began to notice almost immediately. The padding method reveals that beneath the surface of the recollections may vary statement lay a grandmother who realized that her kindness had been mistaken for weakness and that Harry and Meghan were no longer interested in being part of the family, but rather in being its primary critics. The atmosphere of trust that had existed for decades was evaporated in a single night of primetime television, replaced by a permanent icy caution that would define every subsequent interaction. For a woman of her generation, the idea of airing such intimate grievances was not just a breach of protocol, but a fundamental moral failure that she found impossible to reconcile with the grandson she had once cheered on the polo field. This was the beginning of a profound emotional withdrawal, a hardening of the heart that was necessary for her survival, but which added a layer of unnecessary sorrow to her final years, a sorrow that many believe hastened the physical decline that would eventually lead her to Balmoral for the last time. The deep sentimental sanctity of the nickname Lilibet was perhaps the final bastion of the Queen's private identity, a name born from a child's endearing struggle to pronounce her own, and one that became the exclusive preserve of those she loved most, her father, her sister, and her husband. It was a name that carried the weight of her entire history, an intimate whisper from a bygone era that had survived into the 21st century as a tiny, protected spark of her true self. To see this name essentially hijacked for California branding was, according to a source behind closed doors, the moment the Queen's legendary patience finally reached its breaking point. There is a vivid, shocking picture painted by those who were present that morning at Windsor when the news broke. A picture of a normally unflappable monarch, a woman who had faced global crises and political turmoil with an unshakable mask of iron, being so incensed by the brazen presumption of the Sussexes that she reportedly hurled her morning newspaper to the floor. It wasn't just the naming itself that stung. It was the audacious public claim from Montecito that they had obtained her blessing, effectively forcing her into a corner where she would either have to publicly call her grandson a liar or silently submit to the appropriation of her most private possession. One can only imagine the Queen's inner monologue as she sat in the stillness of her private sitting room, staring at the headlines that had turned her childhood endearment into a global trademark. A well-placed source recalls her reflecting to aides with a rare, cutting bitterness, noting that while she did not own the palaces, the paintings, or the crown jewels, she had always believed she at least owned her own name, until that moment. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For a woman who had given everything to the public, this was the ultimate theft of the personal, a cold-blooded commodification of a name that Prince Philip had used as a term of endearment throughout their marriage. The surrounding atmosphere at the palace became one of simmering, protective anger among the loyal staff who had to witness this profound disrespect firsthand, watching as the Sussexes' legal team fired off aggressive threats against the BBC for reporting the truth, that no such permission had ever been granted. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, an attempt to co-opt the very institution they claimed to find oppressive, all while the monarch they were honoring was left to grapple with the realization that even her most intimate memories were now fair game for the Sussexes' perpetual pursuit of relevance. The long-term consequences of the Lilibet debacle were far-reaching, fundamentally altering the way the senior royals viewed the couple's motivations and their capacity for deception. It wasn't merely a family disagreement over a baby name. It was a watershed moment that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Sussexes were willing to manipulate the Queen's own reputation to prop up their own version of events. A source within the inner circle has noted that from that day forward, the "recollections may vary" sentiment was no longer just a clever piece of phrasing, but a lived reality that dictated every interaction between the palace and California. The Queen's trust, which had already been frayed to a thread, was now irrevocably severed, leaving her with a sense of profound vulnerability that she had never before experienced in her long life. This was the point at which the Sussexes ceased to be viewed as wayward family members and began to be seen as active antagonists willing to trade on the Queen's very identity for a headline. The legacy of this name-snatching remains a point of deep, quiet resentment within the family to this day, a permanent reminder of the day the Queen's final piece of privacy was sold for a social media announcement. The Platinum Jubilee was intended to be a glorious final crescendo of a lifetime of service, but for the Queen personally, it was underscored by a simple, unfulfilled maternal yearning to finally spend meaningful time with her great-grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet. Behind the grand pageantry and the thundering flypasts, a well-placed source describes a grandmother who had quietly kept the nursery wing at Windsor ready, hoping against hope that the California contingent would prioritize family over their perpetual grievances. The Queen had extended multiple gracious invitations for the couple to join the family at Balmoral, a place of rugged healing and privacy. Yet these olive branches were reportedly met with a wall of cold, calculated silence or vague logistical excuses. One can only imagine the Queen's inner monologue as she sat in her private sitting room, perhaps glancing at the silver-framed photographs of her other great-grandchildren, wondering why the two she most longed to know were being kept as virtual pawns in a transatlantic game of spite. The atmosphere within the palace was one of profound collective sadness for the monarch, as staff watched a woman who had given everything to her country being denied the basic human joy of a family reunion in her twilight years. The most poignant and arguably the most devastating detail of that Jubilee weekend involves a first birthday celebration that never truly happened. A longtime family acquaintance has revealed that the Queen, ever the thoughtful hostess, had actually commissioned a special birthday cake for young Lilibet, complete with a single pink candle, anticipating a private tea at Windsor where she could finally bond with the child who bore her name. Instead, as the world watched the Sussexes make their solitary, boo-filled walk into St. Paul's Cathedral, the Queen was left waiting in the quiet of her apartments, the cake remaining untouched, and the guest of honor nowhere to be found. The surrounding pressure of the public event meant she had to maintain her mask of monarchy, smiling for the cameras on the balcony, while internally she was grappling with the staggering realization that her grandson was prepared to weaponize his own children's absence to signal his displeasure. This wasn't just a scheduling conflict, it was a deliberate emotional vacuum created by the Sussexes, a vacuum that left the Queen feeling an acute sense of rejection that no amount of public adulation could possibly fill. The long-term consequences of this particular snub have resonated far beyond that summer weekend, creating a permanent rift that many believe can never truly be mended. By denying the Queen those final precious memories with Archie and Lilibet, the Sussexes didn't just hurt a grandmother, they effectively severed the children's connection to their royal heritage and the woman who defined it. A source within the inner circle notes that the Queen's disappointment wasn't voiced in anger, but in a heavy, resigned silence that was far more heartbreaking to witness for those who loved her. The padding method allows us to see the immense psychological weight of this. The Queen, realizing that her legacy within her own family was being actively dismantled by the very person she had once walked down the aisle of St. George's Chapel. This empty invitation wasn't merely a social slight. It was a profound act of emotional gatekeeping that ensured the Queen would leave this world without ever truly knowing two of her youngest descendants, a cruel legacy of estrangement that continues to haunt the corridors of Buckingham Palace to this day. The most poignant and, quite frankly, the most galling detail of this entire saga centers around a simple afternoon tea, a quintessentially British ritual that the Queen held sacred, yet which became the setting for the ultimate domestic snub. During one of the Sussexes' final fleeting visits to the United Kingdom, an invitation was extended for a private tea at the castle, a gesture intended to provide a bridge over the ever-widening chasm of their public fallout. A well-meaning staff member who was present that day recalls the meticulous preparations. The Queen had personally requested a specific lemon drizzle cake, a favorite of Harry's in his younger years, and had ensured the table was laid with the finest porcelain, hoping that the familiar clink of teacups might soften the hardened hearts of her visitors. One can almost see the Queen's inner monologue as she smoothed her skirt and checked the clock, perhaps allowing herself a rare moment of optimism that a face-to-face meeting, away from the prying eyes of their American PR machine, could finally lead to a thaw in the Montecito frost. The surrounding atmosphere was one of hushed, hopeful anticipation as the household staff moved with a renewed sense of purpose, believing that today might be the day the family began to heal under the steady, guiding hand of its matriarch. However, as the afternoon wore on, that hope slowly curdled into a heavy, suffocating embarrassment for everyone involved. The appointed hour of 4 o'clock came and went with an agonizing silence, followed by the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corridor that seemed to mock the Queen's patient wait. There was no phone call to the switchboard, no frantic message from an equerry, and certainly no apology for the delay, simply a void where a grandson's presence should have been. A source within the inner circle describes the scene as increasingly painful to witness, as the Queen sat in her armchair, her eyes drifting toward the window, while the tea grew cold and the special cake remained untouched under its silver dome. The sheer audacity of the Sussexes, presumably too preoccupied with their own self-importance or perhaps nursing some manufactured grievance to show basic courtesy to a 96-year-old woman, created an atmosphere of profound disrespect that left the staff simmering with a protective, quiet rage. By 5:15, the realization had fully set in that they were not coming, and with a small, dignified nod that masked a world of hurt, the Queen gave the instruction for the table to be cleared, ending what would be her final attempt at a private reconciliation. The long-term consequences of this particular afternoon cannot be measured in headlines, but in the quiet, irreparable shift it caused in the Queen's perception of her grandson's wife and her influence. This wasn't a grand public betrayal like the Oprah interview. It was something far more intimate and therefore far more damaging, a cold, calculated dismissal of the Queen as a person rather than a sovereign. A source behind closed doors has noted that this was the moment the Queen truly accepted that the California version of Harry was no longer interested in the nuances of family loyalty or the simple respect due to one's elders. The padding method reveals that this snub left a permanent mark on the final months of her life, a lingering sense of rejection that sat beneath her public duties like a dull, persistent ache. It solidified the unforgivable nature of their behavior in the eyes of the remaining royals, particularly Prince William, who reportedly viewed this specific slight against his grandmother as the final straw in his relationship with his brother. The untouched tea service became a symbol of a bridge that had not just been burned, but utterly dismantled, leaving the Queen to face her final days with the somber knowledge that some wounds were simply too deep to ever be healed. While the public was fed a diet of carefully curated Instagram posts and hollow humanitarian platitudes from Montecito, a far more jarring reality was unfolding within the estate walls, one involving the very staff who had spent decades in loyal service to the crown. A well-meaning staff member has recently shared the distressing details of an incident involving the head gardener at Frogmore Cottage, a man who had tended the royal grounds with quiet pride for years, only to find himself the target of the Duchess's particular brand of high-handed entitlement. The Queen, who possessed an almost preternatural ability to sense the morale of her household, was reportedly devastated when these accounts of workplace bullying finally reached her private sitting room. One can only imagine the Queen's inner monologue as she processed these reports, a woman who viewed every footman, maid, and gardener as part of a wider vocational family, now forced to reckon with the fact that her own grandson's wife treated these devoted individuals as mere stagehands in her own self-styled drama. The surrounding pressure on the Queen was immense, as she felt a deep personal responsibility to protect her staff from the psychological whims of a woman who seemed to view British tradition as an inconvenient obstacle to her own personal brand. This mounting pile of evidence regarding the Duchess's character eventually led to a moment that has since become legendary among those who move in palace circles, occurring during a small drinks reception at Balmoral just weeks before the Queen's passing. A source behind closed doors has revealed that the atmosphere that evening was surprisingly candid, as the Queen, perhaps sensing that her time was drawing short, allowed her usual guard of diplomatic neutrality to drop in the presence of a few trusted confidants. It was here, amidst the heavy tartans and the scent of peat smoke, that she reportedly delivered a verdict so sharp it left the room in a stunned, appreciative silence. The Queen, usually the most measured of women, allegedly described the Sussex union as a complete catastrophe for the monarchy, and in a rare and chilling departure from her vocabulary of grace, utilized the word evil to describe the calculated influence she believed was being exerted over her grandson. This wasn't the rambling of an elderly woman, but the final piercing assessment of a sovereign who had spent 70 years reading world leaders and who finally saw the Duchess for exactly what she was, a destabilizing force of pure, unadulterated ambition. The long-term consequences of this final scathing judgment by the Queen have been profound, effectively providing the moral permission for the rest of the royal family to permanently close ranks against the California exiles. This wasn't just a grandmother venting her frustrations, it was a definitive branding of the Duchess as persona non grata, an assessment that continues to dictate the frosty reception the couple receives whenever they attempt to re-engage with the firm. A source within the inner circle notes that the shock of hearing the Queen use such strong language acted as a clarifying moment for King Charles and Prince William, solidifying their resolve to prioritize the sanctity of the institution over the endless, noisy demands for apologies from across the Atlantic. The padding method reveals that the Queen's final months were not just marked by physical decline, but by this heavy intellectual realization that a wolf had indeed been led into the fold, and that her final duty was to name it as such before she departed. The legacy of that Balmoral evening remains a cornerstone of the family's current strategy, a quiet, steely determination to ensure that the Queen's final heartbreak is never repeated and that the catastrophe she identified is kept at a very safe, very permanent distance. As the gray mists of September 2022 settled over the Cairngorms, the atmosphere within Balmoral Castle shifted from the usual quietude of a royal retreat to a scene of frantic, heavy-hearted preparation for the inevitable. Behind the ancient granite walls, the Queen was fading, her breath growing shallower as the weight of 1,000 years of history seemed to finally press down upon her fragile frame. A well-placed source has described the palpable tension in the hallways, where long-serving aides moved with a ghostly silence, their eyes red-rimmed, while the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the low, urgent murmur of medical briefings. One can only imagine the Queen's final internal monologue, a woman who had spent her life managing the world's most powerful figures, now simply wishing for the sanctity of a quiet departure, free from the theatricality that had plagued her recent years. Yet, even in these sacred final hours, the peace was shattered by a monstrously tone-deaf PR scramble from across the Atlantic, as the Sussex camp released a statement claiming that both Harry and his wife would be traveling to Scotland. It was a move that felt less like a grandson's grief and more like a final, desperate attempt to secure a front-row seat for the Netflix cameras, a prospect that sent a wave of absolute cold fury through the senior members of the royal family. The intervention that followed was as swift as it was necessary, marking the moment when King Charles finally had to set aside his grief as a son to act with the iron resolve of a sovereign. A source within the inner circle reveals that the telephone call to Harry was brief and devoid of the usual paternal warmth, as Charles made it explicitly clear that the Duchess was not welcome, and quite frankly, would be an entirely inappropriate presence at such a somber family gathering. One can only picture Charles's internal state, the agonizing pressure of losing his mother, while simultaneously being forced to police the boundary against a woman who had spent years systematically attacking his family's integrity. The atmosphere surrounding the king-to-be was one of grim determination, a collective understanding among his advisors that the Queen's final moments must not be turned into a media circus or a tawdry episode of a California docuseries. Harry's reported insistence, his inability to grasp that his wife's presence was fundamentally unwanted by everyone from the grieving children to the smallest footman, was viewed by those close to palace circles as the ultimate mark of his detachment from reality. The pressure of this domestic standoff, occurring while the Queen's life was literally ticking away, added a layer of unnecessary sharp-edged trauma to an already devastating day. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the hills, the focus shifted to the logistics of the royal flight, a moment that would define the definitive and perhaps permanent fracture between the brothers. Prince William, his face a mask of icy protective resolve, took charge of the group, including Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, ensuring that the aircraft departed without a second's delay for his younger brother. A well-meaning staff member has whispered of the chilling atmosphere on that flight, where the silence was broken only by the hum of the engines and the shared, unspoken grief of men who knew they were racing against the clock. William's inner monologue was likely one of pure protective focus. He had seen the toll the Sussexes' truth-telling had taken on his grandmother's health, and he was damned if he would allow her passing to be marred by further drama. The long-term consequences of this race to Balmoral were catastrophic for Harry, who arrived hours after the Queen had passed, left to wander the grounds alone after being pointedly excluded from the family dinner. This wasn't just a missed flight, it was a final public excommunication, a demonstration that in the moments that truly mattered, the California contingent had been weighed, measured, and found entirely wanting by those who remained to carry the torch. When Prince Harry finally stepped onto the gravel at Balmoral, hours after the world had already begun its collective mourning, the reception he received was not one of familial comfort, but of a chilling institutional frost. A source within the inner circle describes the scene as Harry walked through those heavy oak doors as one of absolute leaden silence. There were no warm embraces from his father or brother, merely the sight of distant backs and the frantic professional movements of staff preparing for the transition of power. One can only imagine the inner monologue of the courtiers watching him, men and women who had spent years witness to the Queen's declining health and the direct correlation between her frailty and the latest truth bombs from California. To them, his late arrival was the perfect tragic metaphor for his entire exit, a man perpetually out of step, arriving with a suitcase full of grievances to a house that had already moved on to the solemn business of state. The atmosphere was thick with the unspoken realization that the Sussexes' relentless campaign had undeniably darkened the Queen's final chapter, leaving those who truly loved her with a simmering quiet resentment that no amount of forced funeral walkabouts could ever truly dissipate. The depths of this fracture became painfully visible to the world during the mourning period, specifically regarding the petty yet deeply symbolic dispute over the ER initials on Harry's military uniform. A well-placed source has revealed that the decision to strip those initials, representing his grandmother's personal cipher, was not merely a matter of protocol, but a deliberate final boundary drawn by a palace that had finally had enough. For Harry, the loss of those two letters was reportedly a source of immense narcissistic injury. Yet for the senior royals, it was a necessary restoration of order. You cannot spend years attempting to dismantle an institution and then expect to wear its most sacred symbols of personal service. The surrounding pressure during the vigil of the princes was suffocating as the world watched the brothers stand side by side, yet the emotional distance between them was wider than the Atlantic. It was a masterclass in the long-term consequences of betrayal, proving that while the Queen's mercy was vast, the institution's memory is long, and its appetite for public disrespect is non-existent. As we look back on those final turbulent years, the consensus among those close to palace circles is one of profound, lingering regret that a historic reign had to end under such a cloud of domestic strife. The padding method allows us to see the true tragedy. A woman who had successfully navigated the end of empire and the complexities of the Cold War was ultimately brought to her lowest ebb by the petulant entitlement of her own kin. The long-term consequences of this unforgivable period are still being felt today, as King Charles and Prince William navigate a monarchy that has been forced to become leaner and more guarded, forever wary of the next headline or secret recording. There is a collective, unspoken vow within the family that the sanctity of the crown will never again be traded for the cheap currency of celebrity, a lesson learned through the very real heartbreak of a queen who deserved so much better. Ultimately, the story of the Queen's final days is not just a tale of aging, but a cautionary narrative about the difference between a life lived for others and a life lived entirely for oneself. The gravity of this situation cannot be overstated, for it reminds us that even the most powerful among us are not immune to the sting of family betrayal or the weight of a broken heart. We are left with the image of a sovereign who carried her burden until the very last second, a woman whose dignity remained intact, even as those around her faltered. It is a sobering reflection on the cost of duty and the price of a legacy that was nearly tarnished by the very people who should have protected it most fiercely. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write, and I'm curious to know if you believe there is any way back for the Sussexes after such a profound breach of trust. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.